Alex sets off for a job interview, but his words unexpectedly turn against him. How will one incident change the way he sees himself and the world? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Where are you watching this video from? Alex sat at the edge of his bed, staring down at the freshly polished shoes on his feet. His heart raced, a nervous energy pulsing through his body. Today was the day he had been waiting for. The day that could change everything. After years of hard work at university, countless nights of studying, and a seemingly endless string of internships, this was it. His chance to land his dream job at one of the most prestigious companies in the city. Alex had spent the last week preparing for the interview, memorizing answers to potential questions, and brushing up on every detail about the company. He had read all the guides, watched all the videos on how to impress during an interview, and practiced in front of the mirror until his voice sounded as confident as possible. The position was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, something that could launch his career into the stratosphere. It was everything he had worked toward, and he was determined to succeed. Failure wasn't an option. He told himself this repeatedly, hoping the mantra would calm his nerves. But deep down, he could feel the anxiety building like a wave ready to crash over him. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder in his ears as time edged closer to his interview. He stood up, moving with a robotic precision toward the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, a young white man in his early 20s, clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that exuded professionalism. Alex tugged at his tie, ensuring it was scented and snug, then straightened his jacket. He knew appearance was crucial. First impressions could make or break an interview, and he wanted to look like he belonged in that company. He gave himself one last once-over, his fingers brushing down the front of his jacket. "You've got this," he whispered to himself. "This is your moment." Despite his self-assurance, the nervousness gnawed at him. He tried to steady his breathing, focusing on the long, deep breaths he'd been practicing. His mind raced through the list of accomplishments he had rehearsed, the scholarships he had earned, the projects he had led, the networking connections he had cultivated. It all played in his mind like a highlight reel. But beneath the confidence, a creeping doubt lingered. What if something went wrong? What if all this preparation wasn't enough? Alex checked his phone. It was time to go. He had arranged for a taxi to take him to the office. The ride would give him enough time to mentally prepare, to get into the right headspace. He grabbed his briefcase, casting one last look around his room before heading for the door. But as he stepped outside, his phone buzzed. The notification from the taxi app made his stomach drop. "Your ride has been canceled." "What?" Alex muttered, his fingers frantically tapping the screen. He reopened the app, searching for another ride, but the availability of cars was scarce. Panic flared in his chest. He tried again, but no cars were coming. His interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, and it was already 9:15. The office was across town, and there was no way he could walk or take public transportation and still arrive on time. His pulse quickened, and sweat began to form at the back of his neck. He checked the app once more. Nothing. Alex cursed under his breath, his frustration bubbling over. Of all the days for something to go wrong, it had to be today. He ran down the stairs of his apartment building and burst onto the street, eyes darting up and down for any sign of a passing taxi. The morning rush had already begun, and the streets were buzzing with cars and people, but there were no available taxis in sight. Desperation started to take hold. His hands clenched into fists, and he could feel the minutes slipping away, each one bringing him closer to the possibility of missing the most important opportunity of his life. His mind raced, considering his options, but none of them seemed promising. Without thinking, Alex dashed to the sidewalk, waving his hand frantically at the passing cars. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe he could catch a ride, just this once. He hated the idea of relying on a stranger, But what choice did he have? Each car zoomed past, ignoring his outstretched arm. He cursed again, louder this time, feeling the pressure building in his chest. It was 9:25. If he didn't find a ride soon, he would be late. Finally, a battered old car slowed down beside him. The vehicle's paint was faded, and the engine rumbled like it had seen better days. The driver, a black man in his 40s, leaned out of the window. "Need a ride?" Alex hesitated. This wasn't what he had envisioned. He wanted to arrive at his interview in style, looking like someone who belonged in a high-powered corporate environment. The man's car didn't match the image Alex had crafted in his head. It was old, run down, and nothing about it suggested professionalism. A moment of doubt flickered in his mind, and he glanced at his watch again. 9:28. Time was slipping through his fingers. "Where you headed?" the man asked, noticing Alex's indecision. "Downtown," Alex said, his voice tight with frustration. "I have an important meeting, and my ride fell through." The man nodded. "I can get you there." Alex's heart raced as he weighed his options. Every second counted. There wasn't time to wait for another taxi, and he couldn't afford to be late. He had no choice. "All right, fine," Alex muttered, yanking the door open and sliding into the passenger seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alex's mind raced, filled with frustration and resentment. The man's car wasn't clean, and Alex could feel his irritation growing with every bump in the road. He had planned for everything to be perfect, and now he was stuck in a situation that felt far from ideal. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "So, what's the meeting for? Big day?" Alex didn't want to talk. He wanted to sit in silence, fuming about how things had gone wrong. But the man's question hung in the air, waiting for a response. "Yeah?" Alex said curtly. "It's a job interview. Pretty important." The driver nodded. "I hear you. That's a lot of pressure." Alex didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his mind already on the interview, thinking about how he would explain his potential lateness. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they'd give him a second chance. But the thought of arriving late gnawed at him, amplifying his anxiety. As the car made its way through traffic, the minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Alex tapped his foot impatiently, unable to shake the feeling that everything was slipping away from him. "Could you go any faster?" Alex snapped, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. It was already 9:40. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm going as fast as I can, buddy. Traffic's a bit heavy today." Alex clenched his fists. "Well, I can't be late, all right? This is important." "I get it," the driver said evenly. "I'll do my best." Alex's frustration boiled over. "Your best? That's not good enough. I can't believe I'm stuck in this. He gestured at the interior of the car, his disdain evident. The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "You want me to pull over and let you find another ride?" Alex was about to say yes when he realized how ridiculous it sounded. There wasn't time. He gritted his teeth and stared ahead, refusing to engage any further, but his anger got the better of him. "I should have just waited for a proper taxi. This is a joke." The driver said nothing, focusing on the road. Alex felt a wave of guilt rising in his chest, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize. Not now. Not when everything was going wrong. As they pulled closer to downtown, the clock ticked closer to 10. Alex could feel his stomach churning with nerves. The man pulled the car to a stop in front of the office building, and without a word, Alex jumped out, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the passenger seat. "Thanks," he muttered, not meeting the driver's eyes. He rushed toward the building, already feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Driver. The moment Alex's shoes hit the sidewalk, he could feel the tension in his body ease, just slightly. The office building towered above him, its sleek glass exterior gleaming in the late morning sun. But as he walked through the revolving doors into the grand lobby, his mind was still racing, replaying the events of the last half hour over and over again. He barely glanced at the pristine marble floors, the high ceilings, or the modern artwork that lined the walls. His only concern was getting to his interview on time and erasing the sour taste of what had just happened in the car. As he approached the reception desk, the friendly smile of the woman behind the counter barely registered in his mind. He gave her his name and purpose of visit, his thoughts still focused on the irritation from the car ride. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was out of his control, and it had left him on edge. "Please have a seat, Mr. Cartwright. Someone will be with you shortly," the receptionist said, gesturing to the sleek, black leather chairs arranged in the lobby. Alex nodded stiffly and sat down, barely acknowledging her words. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrests as he checked the time on his phone. 9:55. He had made it, barely. He should have felt relieved, but instead, his mind was still buzzing with resentment. That car ride had thrown him off completely. The driver, the old beat-up car, the way Alex had felt sitting in the passenger seat, trapped by the ticking clock and his own impatience. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to him like a dark cloud. The truth was, from the moment he saw that the driver was black, something in him had reacted. It wasn't something he liked to admit, even to himself. But the moment he had laid eyes on the man, an unbidden thought had crept into his mind. He's not someone who can get me where I need to go. It wasn't just the car, though that had certainly added to the impression. It was the man himself, his appearance, the way he had spoken, the assumptions Alex had made about him in those first few moments. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around the lobby. The waiting area was quiet, with only a few other people seated at a distance. He ran his fingers through his hair and exhaled slowly, trying to clear his head. He needed to focus on the interview, on making a good impression. Everything else needed to be pushed aside. But the ride, and his reaction to it, still gnawed at him. It had been sheer desperation that had made Alex climb into that car. He hadn't wanted to. Everything about the situation had screamed wrong to him. The old car, the casual tone of the driver, the slight hesitation in Alex's own mind when he saw the man behind the wheel. But time had been running out, and he couldn't afford to wait for another ride. Now, sitting in the pristine waiting room of one of the city's top firms, he couldn't shake the memory of that moment when he'd crossed the line. At first, the conversation had been civil enough, just small talk, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the minutes ticked by and traffic slowed, Alex had felt the pressure mount. Every red light, every pause in the flow of cars had driven him closer to the edge. And then, in a moment of pure frustration, he had lashed out. He could still hear his own voice, tight with anger, saying the words he wished he could take back. The driver had remained calm, but Alex knew what he had done. He had let his frustration morph into something ugly, something he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. And now, sitting in this upscale lobby, dressed in his best suit, Alex felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He wanted to believe that he was better than that he didn't let prejudice color his interactions. But today, he had failed. His thoughts were interrupted by the receptionist calling his name. He stood quickly, straightening his suit and forcing a confident expression onto his face. It was time to put the past hour behind him. The interview was all that mattered now. "Mr. Cartwright, the hiring manager will see you now," the receptionist said with a polite smile, gesturing toward a set of double doors at the far end of the room. Alex nodded, muttering a quick thank you before striding toward the doors. As he walked down the long corridor, his heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't out of panic. It was anticipation. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Everything he had worked for had led to this interview. He just needed to focus, stay calm, and make the best impression possible. He pushed open the doors and stepped into the office. The room was spacious, with large windows offering a sweeping view of the city skyline. At the far end of the room, a man sat behind a large, polished desk, his back to the windows. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The man behind the desk wasn't the stern, middle-aged corporate executive Alex had imagined. Instead, it was the same man who had just driven him to the building, the black driver he had insulted not even an hour earlier. For a split second, Alex froze. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It couldn't be. How could this man, this driver, be sitting in the chair of the hiring manager at one of the most prestigious firms in the city? But there was no mistaking it. The man looked up from his desk, meeting Alex's stunned gaze with a calm, knowing expression. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a glimmer of recognition. "Mr. Cartwright, I presume?" the man said, his voice measured and polite, though there was a hint of something else beneath the surface, something that made Alex's stomach churn with dread. Alex swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, but his mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. He had just spent the last half hour berating this man, treating him with utter disrespect, and now he was sitting across from him, about to interview for his dream job. "Yes," Alex managed to say, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. "Yes, I'm Alex Cartwright." The man nodded, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, have a seat." Alex moved stiffly toward the chair, every step feeling like it was in slow motion. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms had begun to sweat. He sat down, trying to avoid the man's gaze, but it was impossible. The reality of the situation was sinking in fast. "I understand you're here for the senior analyst position," the man said, his tone professional, yet there was an underlying edge that Alex couldn't ignore. "Yes, sir," Alex replied, his mouth dry. He wanted to say something more, something to address the elephant in the room, but the words wouldn't come. How could he even begin to apologize for what had happened earlier? The man leaned back in his chair, studying Alex for a moment before speaking again. "I'm David Lawson, head of recruitment for the firm, and I believe we've already had the pleasure of meeting." Alex's face flushed with shame. His mind raced, searching for a way out, some way to salvage this disaster, but there was none. The memory of his rude comments, his impatient behavior, and, worst of all, his thinly veiled racism hung in the air between them. I'm sorry," Alex stammered, the words finally spilling out. "About earlier, I didn't realize—" Lawson held up a hand, cutting him off. "There's no need to explain, Mr. Cartwright. We both know what happened, and we both know why it happened." Alex's stomach dropped. He had no defense, no excuse for his behavior. He had let his frustration get the best of him, and now he was paying the price. Lawson leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, piercing through Alex's fragile attempt at composure. "I've seen this kind of behavior before," he said quietly. "People make assumptions. They judge. They think they know who you are, what you're worth, just by looking at you." Alex swallowed, his throat tight. He had never felt so small, so exposed. "But the thing is, Mr. Cartwright," Lawson continued, his voice steady, "you can't judge someone by the car they drive, or the color of their skin, or the job you think they're doing. People are more than the labels we put on them." Alex nodded, unable to meet Lawson's gaze. He felt a deep shame creeping over him, the weight of his own prejudices pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. There was a long silence as Lawson leaned back again, studying Alex with a contemplative expression. Finally, he spoke. "We'll proceed with the interview," he said. "But know this, Mr. Cartwright. Your actions today will be taken into account." Alex's heart sank. He knew what that meant. Even if he aced the interview, his behavior had already sealed his fate. The rest of the interview passed in a blur. Alex answered the questions mechanically, his mind barely registering what he was saying. All he could think about was the look on Lawson's face, the disappointment in his voice. and the realization that his own actions had cost him everything. By the time the interview ended, Alex was drained. He stood to leave, feeling like a man walking to his own execution. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Lawson," Alex said, his voice hollow. Lawson nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. "Good luck, Mr. Cartwright." As Alex walked out of the office, he knew one thing for certain. Luck had nothing to do with it anymore. Chapter 3. Waiting and Tension. As Alex stepped out of David Lawson's office, the door closing softly behind him, he felt a cold, gnawing emptiness in his chest. His heart pounded in his ears, and his legs felt heavy as he made his way back to the lobby. It was as if the weight of the interview, the regret, and the shame all pressed down on him at once. The pristine halls of the office building seemed to stretch longer than before, and the air felt thick, stifling his every breath. He had wanted this job so badly, but now, with the sting of his earlier actions still fresh in his mind, it felt like he had sabotaged his own future. As he reached the lobby, the receptionist offered him a polite smile, but Alex barely noticed her. He sank into one of the leather chairs, his mind racing in circles, replaying every second of the disastrous morning. The ride in the car, his impatience, his outburst, the racist comments that had slipped from his mouth. And finally, the gut-wrenching moment when he had walked into the interview room to see the very man he had insulted sitting behind the desk. He rubbed his hands over his face, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety. But it clung to him like a shadow, refusing to leave. How could he have been so careless, so short-sighted? He had always considered himself above such behavior, someone who believed in fairness, equality, respect. But today, under pressure, he had revealed a side of himself that even he didn't want to acknowledge. Alex leaned back in the chair, staring at the high ceiling of the lobby. The interview hadn't even been the worst part. It was the silence that had followed. David Lawson's calm demeanor, the way he had addressed Alex's behavior without raising his voice, but with an authority that had pierced through Alex's thin facade of confidence. The fact that Lawson hadn't lost his composure only made Alex feel more ashamed. He had been given no room to deflect or defend himself. He had to sit there, helpless, facing the consequences of his own actions. The minutes ticked by, and Alex's nerves refused to settle. His thoughts twisted in on themselves, oscillating between regret and desperation. Would Lawson tell the hiring board about what had happened in the car? Or worse, had Lawson already made up his mind during the interview, knowing full well that he would never hire someone who had behaved so poorly? Alex shifted in his seat, staring at the receptionist's desk. A part of him wanted to run, to leave the building and escape the mess he had made. But another part of him, the part that had worked so hard to get to this point, told him to stay, to face whatever came next, no matter how painful. He had come this far, and walking away now would only make things worse. Yet, as he sat there, every fiber of his being was screaming at him to go, to put this entire morning behind him, and pretend it had never happened. But there was no pretending. He had seen Lawson's expression, the quiet disappointment that hung in the air after the interview. No matter what he did, he couldn't undo what had been said. The receptionist interrupted his thoughts with a soft voice. "Mr. Cartwright, the hiring board is running a bit behind schedule. You may have to wait a little longer." Alex nodded absently, trying to muster a polite response. "That's fine. Thank you." But fine was the last thing he felt. The wait only intensified the storm of emotions inside him. He had never been this close to a breakdown before, but the sheer weight of his mistake bore down on him relentlessly. The longer he sat there, the more his mind conjured up new fears. What if they were discussing his behavior right now, deciding that he wasn't the right fit for the company because of how he had treated Lawson? What if the interview hadn't mattered at all, and Lawson's calm, collected demeanor was just a professional courtesy before rejecting him? Alex gripped the arms of the chair tightly, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let his mind spiral out of control. He had to believe there was still hope, some slim chance that they would overlook his mistake in the car and see his potential. He knew his qualifications were strong. His resume spoke for itself. He had experience, education, ambition. All of that had to count for something, didn't it? Yet every time his mind wandered back to that car ride, he felt the same sickening twist in his gut. How could he have been so blind, so quick to judge? Alex shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others in the waiting area. They all seemed calm, composed, flipping through their phones or reading magazines as they waited for their own meetings. But Alex felt like an imposter among them. His calm exterior was crumbling, and no matter how hard he tried to keep it together, the anxiety gnawing at his insides refused to subside. His thoughts returned to Lawson. The man had been so calm, so composed, even as Alex had treated him with disrespect. And now Alex understood that calmness for what it truly was, a quiet dignity. Lawson had taken the high road, and Alex had exposed himself as someone he never thought he could be. The realization stung, deeper than anything Alex had ever experienced before. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing second, Alex's nerves frayed further. He was restless, his foot tapping anxiously on the polished floor, his thoughts racing back to every detail of the morning. He kept glancing at the receptionist, waiting for her to call his name again, hoping that when she did, it would signal the start of something positive. But as time passed, the silence around him only made the tension worse. His thoughts spiraled into a cacophony of self-doubt, shame, and worry. He imagined the worst-case scenarios, being rejected outright, or worse, being escorted out of the building with a polite but firm dismissal. His stomach churned at the thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the receptionist approached him again. "Mr. Cartwright, we apologize for the delay. The board is ready to see you now." Alex's heart raced. This was it, the moment of truth. He stood, straightening his suit jacket and running a hand through his hair in an attempt to compose himself. But inside, he was anything but composed. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, regret, and anticipation. As he followed the receptionist down the hallway toward the meeting room, his thoughts raced back to the moments before the interview, the look on Lawson's face, the realization that the man he had insulted was now in control of his future. He wanted to apologize again, to make it right somehow, but the moment for that had passed. Now, all he could do was face whatever came next. The doors to the meeting room opened, and Alex stepped inside. The room was large, with a long table in the center and several men and women seated around it. They were the company's hiring board, the people who would decide whether he would get the job. Alex swallowed hard as he took a seat at the far end of the table, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them in front of him. His mind was spinning, but he forced himself to focus. This was his chance, and he couldn't afford to blow it. The board members introduced themselves, their voices formal and measured. Alex smiled nervously and tried to relax, but his body was tense with anticipation. "We've reviewed your application, Mr. Cartwright," one of the board members began, "and we're very impressed with your qualifications." Alex's heart skipped a beat. Was there still hope? Could they really overlook what had happened earlier? "But," the board member continued, and Alex's heart sank again. "We've also spoken with Mr. Lawson, and he shared some concerns about your behavior today." Alex felt the blood drain from his face. Of course, Lawson had said something. How could he not? The board member continued. "We understand that interviews can be stressful, and sometimes people act out of character under pressure, but we also value professionalism and respect for others. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened this morning?" Alex's mouth went dry. He hadn't expected to be confronted so directly, and now he was faced with a choice. He could try to explain it away, blame the traffic, the stress, the panic he had felt. Or he could tell the truth, the real, ugly truth. For a moment he was tempted to lie, to spin a story that would make him look better. But as he looked at the faces of the board members and remembered Lawson's calm but piercing words, he knew that wasn't an option. He couldn't run from this. Not anymore. I was impatient, Alex began, his voice shaky. I was frustrated because I thought I might be late, and I took it out on Mr. Lawson. I said things I regret, things I didn't mean. And I realize now that it was wrong, completely wrong. I'm deeply ashamed of how I acted. The room was silent for a moment, and Alex could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He had admitted his mistake, but was it too little, too late? One of the board members nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Cartwright. We'll take that into consideration. Alex could only nod in response. His fate was now out of his hands. As he left the meeting room and made his way back to the lobby, Alex felt drained. The interview had taken everything out of him, and now all he could do was wait. Wait to see if his apology, his admission of guilt, would be enough to salvage his chances. But deep down, he knew that the damage had already been done. The waiting was the hardest part. Alex's legs felt like lead as he moved back to the waiting area, each step heavier than the last. He didn't even notice the receptionist's polite nod this time. His thoughts were a blur, circling the same fears and regrets. The meeting with the board had gone as badly as he feared, and now he was stuck in the worst place he could imagine, waiting, helpless, for a decision that seemed inevitable. He sat down in the same chair, his body sagging with exhaustion. He felt like a balloon that had been punctured and was slowly deflating. The adrenaline that had kept him going through the interview was gone, leaving only a gnawing dread in its place. He tried to distract himself, pulling out his phone and scrolling aimlessly through emails and news, but nothing could take his mind off the disaster he had just walked out of. Why did I say those things? He asked himself for the 100th time. He kept replaying the morning in his head, from the moment the taxi canceled to his panicked scramble to find a ride. He had been so focused on not being late that he had forgotten how important it was to be professional, to be decent. And now, all that remained was the echo of his own mistakes. As the minutes dragged by, his mind wandered back to the interview room, to David Lawson's calm, measured voice. The words he had spoken earlier played in Alex's head like a haunting melody. People are more than the labels we put on them. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his chest tight with a mixture of shame and anxiety. Lawson had been more gracious than Alex deserved. If their roles had been reversed, Alex wasn't sure he would have handled the situation with the same calm dignity, but that only made him feel worse. The man he had insulted had treated him with more respect and professionalism than he had shown to the world all day. A voice in his head whispered, "You blew it," and he couldn't silence it. After what felt like an eternity, Alex was finally called back to the office, this time not by the receptionist, but by David Lawson himself. Alex's pulse quickened. His earlier shame resurfaced in full force as Lawson approached him, a polite but unreadable expression on his face. "Mr. Cartwright, if you could follow me," Lawson said, his tone calm, neutral. It was neither welcoming nor hostile, just professional. Alex nodded, rising to his feet, his legs stiff. He followed Lawson down the corridor once more, back toward the meeting room. As they walked, the silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Alex wanted to say something, to apologize again, to explain himself further, but he couldn't find the words. Nothing he said would undo what had happened. Lawson opened the door to the conference room, gesturing for Alex to enter. As he did, his stomach churned. It was the same room where the hiring board had sat just minutes ago. But now it was empty, except for one person, David Lawson, sitting at the head of the table, just as before. "Please, have a seat," Lawson said, motioning toward the chair in front of him. Alex sat down, his palms sweaty, his mind racing. He braced himself for the worst, for the polite rejection, the thinly veiled disappointment. The words that would confirm his deepest fear, that he had ruined his chances, not just for this job, but for any job in this field. His mind was already preparing for the fallout, for the phone calls to his family explaining that he hadn't gotten the position, for the lingering shame of knowing he had let himself, and everyone who believed in him, down. But when Lawson spoke, his words caught Alex off guard. "You know, Mr. Cartwright," Lawson began, his voice steady but soft. "I've been in this position before. Many times, in fact." Alex blinked, confused. This wasn't the direction he had expected the conversation to take. Lawson leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying Alex with a quiet intensity. "When I was younger, just starting out in my career, I made my own mistakes. Different from the one you made today, but mistakes all the same. And I had to learn from them, just like everyone does." Alex felt a flicker of something, hope, in his chest. Was Lawson offering him a chance? "The thing is," Lawson continued, "everyone, at some point, faces a moment where they have to confront their own prejudices. It's uncomfortable, painful even, but it's necessary. You said something earlier that showed me a part of you that I don't think you were fully aware of until today." Alex's throat tightened. He knew exactly what Lawson was referring to. The racial slurs, the impatience, the judgments he had made without a second thought. "You acted out of frustration and fear," Lawson said, his voice steady. "But you also acted out of a place that was rooted in bias, whether you realized it or not. And I don't hold that against you. We're all products of the environments we come from. But the real test is whether we're willing to grow beyond that." Alex swallowed, his mouth dry. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but no words came. Lawson was right. Everything he said was true. Alex had been raised in a world where certain assumptions about race, about people, were baked into the fabric of society. He had never questioned it. Not really. Not until today, when his own actions had been held up to a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. "I'm not going to reject you based on one moment of weakness," Lawson said, leaning forward slightly. "But I need to know that you're committed to being better than this. Not just for yourself, but for the people you'll be working with, the people you'll be leading someday." Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was Lawson really giving him a second chance? "I want to give you an opportunity," Lawson continued. "But before we go any further, I need you to understand that this isn't just about getting a job. This is about who you are and who you want to become. The person I hire into this company needs to be someone who can look beyond their own experiences, their own assumptions, and see the bigger picture." Alex nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to say something, anything, but all he could do was nod. He was overwhelmed with gratitude, with relief, but also with a deep sense of responsibility. This was his moment of reckoning, and he couldn't afford to squander it. "I can't promise you that this will be easy," Lawson said, his gaze unwavering. "You'll need to prove yourself, not just in your work, but in how you carry yourself, how you treat others. This company values integrity above all else, and that means confronting your own biases head-on." Alex took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on him. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know I made a mistake today, and I'm committed to doing better. I want to learn from this. I want to be better." Lawson studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Good," he said. "That's what I wanted to hear." Alex felt a surge of relief wash over him. It wasn't over. He still had a chance to prove himself, to show that he was more than his mistakes. "We'll be in touch about the next steps," Lawson said, standing up and offering his hand to Alex. "But remember, this is just the beginning. What happens next is up to you." Alex stood, shaking Lawson's hand, feeling a mixture of gratitude and humility. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Lawson gave him a small, approving nod before gesturing toward the door. "I hope you don't, Mr. Cartwright. Good luck." As Alex walked out of the building, the weight of the morning still pressed heavily on him. But there was also a new sense of purpose. He had been given a second chance, one he knew he didn't deserve, but one that he was determined to make the most of. The sun was bright overhead as he stepped onto the sidewalk, and for the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. Yes, he had made mistakes. Yes, he had shown a side of himself he wasn't proud of. But now, he had the opportunity to change, to be better. And for the first time, he felt like that was something he could achieve. He started walking, the sounds of the city around him, his thoughts still swirling. He had a long road ahead, but he was ready for it. The fresh air outside the office did little to calm Alex's racing mind as he walked down the busy street. People bustled around him, cars honked in the distance, and the usual energy of the city enveloped him, but Alex felt completely disconnected from it all. His thoughts swirled with everything that had happened in the last few hours, replaying Lawson's words again and again. You need to prove yourself, not just in your work, but in how you carry yourself, how you treat others. Those words echoed in his mind like a mantra, each repetition reminding him of the responsibility he now bore. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about becoming the kind of person he had always thought he was. Someone better than the man who had judged David Lawson in that car, who had let his frustration and fear boil over into something ugly. But was he ready for that kind of change? Could he really become that person? His steps slowed as he came to a quiet corner of the city park. The greenery provided a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the surrounding streets. Alex found a bench, sat down, and finally let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time since that morning, he allowed himself to truly reflect on what had happened. His mind drifted back to the moments before the interview, the harsh words he had hurled at Lawson, the racist comments that had escaped his mouth in a moment of weakness. "I'm not going to reject you based on one moment of weakness." Lawson's words were generous, far more than Alex deserved, and that was what weighed on him now, the knowledge that he had been given a second chance despite his behavior. But second chances didn't erase the harm done. His actions still had consequences, not just for his job prospects, but for who he was as a person. The shame gnawed at him, deeper now that the immediate pressure of the interview had passed. Alex had grown up in a middle-class, predominantly white neighborhood. His friends, his family, even his school teachers, had never really forced him to confront his own biases. He had always considered himself progressive, open-minded, the kind of person who didn't see race, who treated everyone the same. But today had shattered that self-image. He had seen the truth, his own prejudice laid bare, and it terrified him. Sitting there, Alex knew that confronting his biases wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't something he could fix with an apology or a promise. It would require more than just words. It would require him to change the way he thought, the way he treated people, especially those who didn't look like him or share his background. But where did he even start? A few days later, Alex received an email from the company's HR department. His heart leaped when he saw the subject line, "Next steps, senior analyst position." He clicked on it immediately, scanning the message with nervous anticipation. It wasn't a rejection, at least not outright. The email invited him to a follow-up meeting with Lawson to discuss the position further. Alex's relief was short-lived. He knew this wasn't just about the job. It was about proving that he was willing to take accountability for his actions. Lawson had made it clear that professionalism and respect were non-negotiable at the company, and Alex's behavior during the car ride had already put him on shaky ground. If he didn't show that he had learned something from the experience, it was over. The following day, Alex arrived at the office for his scheduled meeting. The air felt different this time. He was no longer the cocky, overconfident candidate who had walked in a week ago. Now he felt humble, uncertain, and more than a little afraid. But he was also determined. He had spent the last few days reflecting on what had happened, and he knew this was his chance to prove he could change. Lawson greeted him in the lobby, just as he had during their initial meeting. His expression was unreadable, but his demeanor was professional, as always. "Good to see you again, Mr. Cartwright," Lawson said, extending his hand. Alex shook it, his own grip firm but nervous. "Thank you for the opportunity to meet again, Mr. Lawson," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Lawson nodded and led him back to the same meeting room as before. As they sat down, the tension in the air was palpable, but Lawson's calm presence helped steady Alex's nerves. "So," Lawson began, folding his hands on the table, "I wanted to speak with you today to follow up on our last conversation. I'm curious, what have you taken away from our previous meeting? What have you learned?" Alex's mouth went dry. This was the moment. He couldn't afford to stumble now. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts before he spoke. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened that day," Alex began, choosing his words carefully. "And I've realized that I was wrong, completely wrong. I let my frustration get the better of me, and I took it out on you. Worse, I let my own biases affect how I treated you, and that's something I deeply regret." Lawson's expression didn't change, but his eyes remained fixed on Alex, listening intently. "I used to think that I was above that kind of behavior," Alex continued, "that I didn't have those kinds of prejudices. But the truth is, I did. I do. And that's something I need to work on. I can't excuse what I said or did that day, but I want to take responsibility for it. And I want to learn from it." There was a pause. Alex could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for Lawson to respond. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Lawson leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Cartwright," he said after a moment. "It's not easy to admit when we've been wrong, especially about something as deeply ingrained as our own biases." Alex nodded, grateful for the chance to speak openly. But he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to show that he was willing to change, not just say it. "You mentioned wanting to learn," Lawson continued. "What exactly does that look like for you? How do you plan to address what happened and ensure it doesn't happen again?" Alex had been preparing for this question. He had thought long and hard about how to move forward, and he knew that it wouldn't be enough to just promise to do better. "I've been doing a lot of research," Alex said, his voice steady. "I've started reading more about systemic racism, about unconscious bias, and how it affects our everyday interactions. I know that just educating myself isn't enough, but I think it's an important first step. I also want to start having more conversations with people who've had different experiences than me, people from different backgrounds, different cultures, so I can learn from them and understand perspectives beyond my own." Lawson's gaze remained steady, but Alex thought he saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. "I know this is a lifelong process," Alex continued, "and I'm not going to pretend that I can change overnight. But I'm committed to doing the work, both in my personal life and professionally. I want to be part of a workplace that values diversity, that challenges me to grow. And I know that if I want to be part of this company, I need to live up to those values." There was another pause, but this time it felt less tense. Alex had said everything he wanted to say, and now all he could do was wait for Lawson's response. After a long moment, Lawson nodded slowly. "That's a good start, Mr. Cartwright. It's clear to me that you've put some serious thought into this, and I appreciate your willingness to take accountability." Alex felt a small wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that the conversation wasn't over yet. "However," Lawson added, his tone firm but not unkind, Understanding is only one part of the equation. What matters most is action. You've spoken about wanting to learn and grow, and I believe that you're sincere in that, but I also need to see that in practice. The workplace can be challenging, and how you handle yourself in moments of stress will be a key factor in determining your success here. Alex nodded again, taking in Lawson's words. So, Lawson continued, I'm willing to move forward with your candidacy. But I want you to understand that this is not just about your qualifications for the role. This is about how you show up every day, how you interact with your colleagues, and how you contribute to the culture of respect and inclusivity that we value here. Alex's heart lifted slightly. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Lawson was giving him another chance, an opportunity to prove himself, not just professionally, but personally as well. I won't let you down, Alex said, his voice filled with determination. I'm committed to this, both for myself and for the company. Lawson gave him a small, approving nod. Good, then let's move forward. As Alex left the office that day, his emotions were a mix of relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. It was a path of accountability, growth, and understanding, one that would challenge him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But now, he was ready for it. The consequences of his actions had been heavy, but they had also opened a door to something new, the possibility of real change. And for Alex, that was the most important step he could take. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Also, check out our other videos. We have plenty of exciting stories. Leave your comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.